Yes!
The arrival of the Stasis subclasses was one of the most controversial turning points in the Destiny franchise. These new abilities were incredibly powerful, so powerful to the point where the usage of the light subclasses drastically decreased in PvP. Because out of all sides of the game, it was the Crucible that felt the wrath of Stasis the most, and a collective uproar of frustration from the Destiny community reverberated hard enough to the point where some of the most well-known members of the PvP side of the community up and stopped playing the game as a whole. Since the launch of Destiny 2, we've been accustomed to subclass perks and abilities conglomerated into separate skill trees, as opposed to the freedom of mixing and matching subclass perks to our liking that would have placed many of us in the mind of the Destiny 1 days. But the aspects and fragment system of customization belonging to the Stasis subclasses was a sight for sore eyes, and from this point on, Stasis and the new flavor that it brought to Destiny 2 became the golden standard of power fantasy and build crafting. And after several much needed adjustments, the Stasis subclasses are much more in line with the light subclasses than how things were when Stasis initially launched, despite its apparent wider access avenue to more powerful and synergistic abilities compared to that and or those of the light subclasses. At this juncture, it's been confirmed that the reworkings of the light subclasses is on the horizon, and it's more than safe to say that the light subclasses will be on par, if not better than the Stasis subclasses. In this video, I want you to join me as I venture into speculation land and throw some ideas around regarding how things will be after the light subclasses receive the long overdue facelift. Bungie stated that the void subclasses will be the first ones to receive the rework, while Arc and Solar will receive theirs later on down the line. But in this video, I'll go over what we should expect with all the light subclasses as a whole. So, with all of that out the way, let's go ahead and get it in. With the release of the Forsaken expansion, arrived 3 new subclass skill trees for each of the Guardian classes. We were given Attunement of Control, Attunement of Grace, and Attunement of Fission for Warlocks, Code of the Missile, Code of the Commander, and Code of the Devastator for Titans, and Way of 1,000 Cuts, Way of the Current, and Way of the Wraith for the Hunter class. Bungie marketed these new abilities as new quote-unquote supers, but if you really think about it, that's only partially true. The Warlock class was the only of the 3 that received 3 completely new supers: Nova Warp, Chaos Reach, and Well of Radiance. The Titans got Thunder Crash and Burning Maw, and the Hunters got Blade Barrage and Spectral Blades. Unfortunately, Code of the Commander and Way of the Current aren't entirely new supers at all. Aside from Way of the Current's ability to spin the staff and block incoming projectiles, and the size difference between Code of the Commander's Banner Shield and the Sentinel Shield Bearer belonging to Top and Bottom Tree Sentinel, these supers are exactly the same as Top and Bottom Tree Arc Strider and Sentinel. Now, I decided to shed some light on this solely because Bungie stated some time ago that it's possible that some supers might get cut, and since there was zero transparency or comprehensive detail regarding exactly which supers would be cut, the Destiny community began to collectively worry that some of our favorite abilities would be removed from the game. I can confidently state that the supers that we know and love aren't going anywhere, but if you take a second and realize the superlatives Middle Tree Sentinel and Arc Strider have over their Top and Bottom Tree brethren, it's more than safe to assume that Banner Shield and Spinny Stab Pole Dancer will be the default forms of the Arc Strider and Sentinel subclasses, since, once again, the other versions of these supers don't do anything special. Either that or Banner Shield and Arc Staff's reflective properties will be converted into subclass perks instead. This might be the most logical route to take because that's pretty much how things are as of presently. Now I want to bring something to your attention. When it comes to the light subclasses, you'll see the description of the super on the left side of the screen and the skill trees on the right. The top and bottom trees consist of 4 different perks, but the middle trees have 3 perk nodes, while the 4th is reserved for the super itself. This is even more apparent for Middle Tree Sentinel and Arc Strider. I'm pretty sure Bungie did things this way because there could have been numerous balancing issues derived from providing the Forsaken supers with the abilities of the top and bottom trees if we were simply able to scroll over to the left side of the screen and select a different super. Year 1 of Destiny 2 was riddled with restrictions. One of the most notable offenders was the lack of subclass customization. This wasn't the case in Destiny 1 because back then, players had the option to mix and match different subclass skill tree perks, so it should make sense why nobody took a liking to Destiny 2's preset subclass ability skill trees. I'm proud to have been a Destiny 1 player since the earliest days of D1, but admittedly, a lot of people place the customizable subclass perks on too high of a pedestal. Don't get me wrong. The freedom of choice aspect was amazing, and I can't wait until it comes back in Destiny 2, but the majority of the subclass perks had very low usage rates because they were either terrible or not all that viable as a whole. So back in D1, everybody ended up running the same perks anyways. No joke, I was a devout Voidwalker main in Destiny 1, and I thought that I knew this subclass in and out until one day I was playing Trials of Osiris in year 3 of D1 and noticed the word Surge popped up on my screen after meleeing an enemy. I asked one of my fire team members, who was also running a Voidwalker Warlock at the time, if that was his ability, because in my mind, I was probably benefiting from one of my fire team members' abilities, and he answered no, it wasn't his ability. After the match ended, I inspected my subclass and found out that I must have mistakenly selected a surge perk node, and when I read it, it stated that damaging an enemy with energy drain increases your weapon and movement speed. I've always ran lifesteal, which states that damaging an enemy with energy drain immediately restores a significant portion of your health. Well, I ended up learning something new that day, because before that moment, I never once used surge or anything else aside from lifesteal, ever. Granted, this could have been an example of me not dedicating enough time to learn the abilities as much as I should have, but looking back on it, lifesteal was easily the most effective of the Void Walker's melee abilities. Well, for me at least. And I don't think I ever got into the habit of switching around my perks for different situations, because in my mind, I was using the abilities I thought were the most viable. And I believe that this is what led to Bungie's decision to group the perks in the skill trees and get rid of a lot of the underutilized perks as a whole. Because think about it, since everybody ended up using the same perks anyways, what would have been the point of retaining all the lackluster ones? And now, we've come to the conclusion that the customizable subclass perk system in D1 wasn't as amazing as the run-of-the-mill D1 veteran would make it out to be. It's more than safe to say that Destiny 1 players prioritized the peace of mind provided by the freedom to select whatever perks and or abilities they wanted over the realization that most of these perks were terrible. So in retrospect, Bungie was doing the right thing, but the subclass ability restrictions in D2 weren't welcomed with open arms despite how logical they were. In the past video, I made some interesting points about the element of stasis and how it functions in game. It was easy to grab a clip from that video instead of paraphrasing. Let's check it out real quick. Now, due to the fact that stasis damage actually does something all the time, it's split up into two different attributes known as freezing and shattering. But shattering is pretty self-explanatory too. Basically, the process of shattering a target solely consists of you doing enough damage to them to cause their frozen form to shatter, thus killing them. These are dynamic extra effects that the light elements do not have their own answer or equivalent to. If they did, I would assume that solar damage will always cause burning damage over time, or arc with shock and slow a target's movement, for example. Well, this does happen some of the time, but not all of the time. And one of the main superlatives of the stasis element is that it either freezes or slows down anyone on the receiving end. This means that stasis is lethal all the time, no matter where it's coming from. Imagine if stasis was available in Destiny 1. The freezing effect would have probably been a perk that you would have to select as one of the subclasses perk nodes, meaning that freezing targets wouldn't be something you'd be able to do all the time. I'll give you an example. Back in D1, there was a perk node on the Warlock Sunsinker skill tree that would grant all solar ability damage the added buff of afflicting enemies with the Ignite debuff. And this ability was known as Viking Funeral. Ignited enemies would take burning damage over time and will receive a debuff that would increase all incoming damage. Now, Viking Funeral was incredibly powerful, and at one point in time it was nerfed because Sunsinger Warlocks literally ran Trials of Osiris, and they were incredibly difficult to compete against. Imagine surviving a slap to the face or a grenade explosion only to burn to death, because that's literally what Viking Funeral did. And again, this would be the solar damage equivalent to the freezing capabilities of stasis. And due to the fact that all solar damage wasn't capable of doing this, it wasn't something that you had to worry about all the time. But with all of this being stated, it makes me wonder how stasis is going to work in the future. Right now, we have one stasis damage weapon in the form of the exotic heavy grenade launcher known as Salvation's Grip. Now, I haven't used this weapon much, but based on a little bit of time that I did use it, I found out that it fires projectiles that will encase enemies in ice. But what blew my mind the most is that since this weapon deals stasis damage, it's compatible with the stasis subclass aspects. Now, I had no idea that this was even a thing, but when I read the description for the ice flare bolts aspect, it stated that shattering a frozen target spawns seekers that track and freeze other nearby targets. This means that you don't even have to be the one that froze the enemies you shattered in the first place, and it doesn't matter how the opponent was frozen. I was in literal astonishment after finding this out, because there's never been a point in time in Destiny history where the light subclasses have been able to influence something that wasn't from its own abilities. The fact that Salvation's Grip benefits from the stasis subclass aspects would be no different in Sunshot proccing Viking Funeral that we spoke of previously. Sunshot is a solar hand cannon, and the Sunsinger subclass was a solar subclass. So how would this? Based on my reaction in that excerpt, you could probably tell that I'm a huge fan of the overall functionality of stasis and how seamlessly stasis from any source interacts with each other. I'm referring to when it comes to the behavior of stasis-based damage or an ability, the source of the stasis doesn't matter, because stasis is treated as one singular entity. And things have never been this way, because before stasis stepped onto the scene, elemental damage from abilities, weapons, and other sources had little to no interactivity with each other. At the time this video was going live, the exotic stasis trace rifle Agar Scepter released not too long ago, and this thing is absolutely insane. Originally, I was fascinated by the Salvation's Grip and its relationship with stasis subclass abilities, but Agar Scepter does that plus so much more. This is hands down one of the most fun exotic weapons I've ever used, because every time I defeated an opponent, ice flare bolts will spawn upon death to freeze the closest opponent, then so on and so forth. If you weren't already aware, ice flare bolts is a Stasis subclass fragment for warlocks, and there's probably several hundred other things happening here, but admittedly I haven't studied the Stasis subclass's abilities enough to know all the inner workings of everything yet. But this made me realize that the idea of Viking Funeral proccing from non-ability based solar damage doesn't sound too far-fetched at all. Let's take a look at the relationship between two exotic weapons of armor. I'm referring to the exotic hand cannon Thorn and the exotic warlock gauntlet's necrotic grip. Thorn's exotic perk is known as Mark of the Devourer, and it states that rounds from this weapon pierce targets and deal damage over time. Kills of this weapon leave behind remnants. Necrotic grip's perk states that damaging combatants envenems them with poison that deals increasing damage over time. Defeating a poison combatant spreads the condition to nearby targets. Now, to proc Necrotic grip's perk, you have to melee an opponent first, and doing so will inflict a damage over time effect. But if Necrotic grip is used alongside Thorn, simply defeating an enemy with Thorn will prompt the Necrotic grip's corruption spreads perk. As far as I'm concerned, this is the first time an exotic armor and weapon have had this level of chemistry, so much to the point that originally this was believed to be a bug because it was one of those too good to be true situations, but Bungie eventually confirmed that this was deliberate and is working as intended. The exotic hand cannon Lumina and the warlock exotic boots of the assembler have a very similar relationship. Boots of the assembler's exotic perk spawns radiant orbs of light known as Noble Seekers, while the user stands within a rift. These Noble Seekers will either empower or heal allies they come in contact with depending on the rift they spawn from. Empowering Seekers spawn from empowering rifts, and healing Seekers spawn from healing rifts. Lumina's exotic perk, Noble Round, spawns objects known as remnants at the spot where an enemy was defeated. You're probably fully aware where I'm headed with all this, because Boots of the Assembler's Noble Seekers and Lumina's remnants are basically the same exact thing. Now, if there ever comes a point in time where your Noble Seekers can't find an ally, they'll turn into Noble Rounds for Lumina to shoot at allies. Oh, and what about Trinity Ghoul? Its Lightning Rod perk normally only procs from headshots, but with the Catalyst, it procs from arc damage from literally any source. Although these examples aren't identical to the interactions between elemental damage from subclass abilities and elemental damage from sources outside of subclass abilities, it still gives us an idea of how things would be if the light subclass abilities had the added benefit of synergizing with elemental damage sources outside of their own influence, like the Stasis subclasses. This would take build crafting to an entirely new level. Now, the most pertinent example would be Trinity Ghoul with its Catalyst, but if the Arc 3.0 subclasses work in a similar fashion, kills with Trinity Ghoul would proc arc abilities, while the arc abilities proc Lightning Rod. I always wish that this was the case in the present day, because whenever I use Trinity Ghoul as a Stormcaller Warlock, I'm always in a mind state that Trinity Ghoul is assisting my arc abilities, and I always need to remind myself that this isn't the case, but it would be cool if it was. One of the more interesting aspects of Destiny 1 would be the exotic armor that I'll always refer to as Freebie exotics. I refer to them as such because when equipped, they would grant the benefits of a particular subclass perk without the need of having the perk node selected in a subclass skill tree. For instance, the Warlock exotic gauntlets, the Impossible Machines, bestow the benefits of the Stormcaller subclass perk known as Landfall, freeing up a slot to use another perk belonging to the same column. The Impossible Machines was commonly paired with Ionic Blink because normally you wouldn't be able to select Ionic Blink and Landfall at the same time since both of these perks belong to the same column, but with the Impossible Machines equipped, you can. Impossible Machines in Destiny 2 would be ridiculous considering how powerful Landfall became after receiving a buff in Season 15. Other notable examples consist of the Titan's Helmet in Most Light and the Hunter's Graviton Forfeit, which granted Shade Step for free. For those of y'all that weren't already aware, back in D1, the Night Stalker was the only of the 3 Hunter subclasses that could dodge. But in Destiny 2, dodge became the Hunter's class ability, which would explain why Destiny 2's version of the Graviton Forfeit functions very differently from the D1 version. Back in D1, Helmet in Most Light was my favorite Titan exotic helmet because it was the only exotic armor that provided not one, but 2 different perks for free: Headstrong and Death from Above. Headstrong increased the leap distance of Fist of Havoc after a sprint, while Death from Above changed the animation of Fist of Havoc to the one that's used for Ballistic Slam in Destiny 2. For those of y'all that never played Destiny 1, this might remind you of the Titan's Harder in Most Light in Destiny 2 because of the similarity in names, but these exotics function very differently. Actually, they don't even function similar at all. They just have similar names and that's it. Now, I wanted to note that exotic armor that will enable us to double dip would have completely countervailed what Bungie hoped to accomplish with the preset perk skill tree system. Destiny 2's skill tree system may be restrictive, but each perk was intended to synergize perfectly with one another, and not a single perk is wasted or considered to be useless for the most part. There's a good reason why Ionic Blink belongs to top tree Stormcaller, why Landfall belongs to bottom tree. So it wouldn't have made sense for these exotics to exist in Destiny 2 in their D1 forms. However, we do have similar examples in Destiny 2, one of them being the Dragon Shadow, whose exotic perk is basically a better version of Marksman's Dodge. But with this exotic equipped, you're able to utilize Gambler's Dodge at the same time. And let's not forget about Wings of Sacred Dawn or Hollow-Fired Heart. Both of these exotics are subclass skill tree perks converted into exotic armor, and I mean that in a very, very literal sense. In D1, Sunsinger Warlocks had access to a perk known as Angel of Light, and via this perk, you will float in mid-air while aiming down sights, while the perk known as Simmering Flames was present on a Titan Sunbreaker subclass skill tree, which would rapidly decrease the cooldown of your grenades in melee if your super meter is full. And now that we know all of this, I wouldn't be surprised if Angel of Light and Simmering Flames ended up returning as perks for their respective 3.0 light subclasses in Destiny 2. This would effectively make Wings of Sacred Dawn and Hollow-Fired Heart freebie exotics, no differently than Impossible Machines and Helmet Inmost Light. But yeah, as far as the freebie exotics go, I could definitely see them returning to Destiny 2. They probably won't function identically to their D1 versions because if the Stasis subclasses are anything to go by, these exotics might end up being a lot better than the D1 versions, considering that there's a lot of craziness going on with the aspects and fragment system. Then again, it hasn't been confirmed if the revamped light subclasses would utilize the aspects and fragment system like the Stasis subclasses do, and with that realization in mind, I wouldn't be surprised if Bungie decided to take a completely different approach with the light subclasses. It's likely that the aspects and fragment system might be a darkness subclass exclusive thing, but who knows. Alright everybody, that does it for this one. Reworking the light subclasses was inevitable, but it's good to know that it's actually confirmed now. The subclass customization freedom in Destiny 1 was decent for the most part, but I honestly believe that things will be even better in Destiny 2. Now if you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed what you watched, do me a favor and thumb rest to that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't ever miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.
Can redeem you and me. Don't you wanna feel something? And oh, I miss loving you, but I need to live my own truth. I wanna feel it all brand new. I found a little something from Miss Angelou. Take the good and hold it near to you, and let go of all that burdens you.